A millionaire stopped to help an elderly woman on a stormy night. What she said changed his life forever. Lightning split the rain-soaked sky as a midnight black Bentley crawled through Manhattan's deserted streets. Inside, Michael Sterling, Wall Street's most ruthless billionaire, loosened his bow tie, the taste of expensive whiskey still lingering from another hollow charity gala. Through the rain-streaked windshield, his headlights caught a frail figure, an elderly woman in tattered clothes, desperately pushing a wheelchair through shin-deep flood water. Her eyes met his through the glass, filled with a desperation that pierced his carefully constructed walls. For the first time in decades, Sterling's finger moved to the window control, hesitating over the button. Let me know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments and don't forget to hit that subscribe button before we dive into this life-changing story that touched millions of hearts worldwide. Michael Sterling stood at the pinnacle of Manhattan's financial elite, his name synonymous with ruthless success and cold efficiency. At 45, he commanded Sterling Industries, a healthcare conglomerate worth billions, from his office on the 87th floor of a glass tower that seemed to pierce the clouds themselves. His appearance, perpetually adorned in bespoke suits that cost more than most cars, matched the carefully cultivated image of corporate perfection. Yet beneath the polished exterior lay a man haunted by the shadows of his past. 20 years earlier, Sterling had watched his parents succumb to illness in an underfunded county hospital, unable to afford the treatment that might have saved them. His father, a factory worker, and his mother, a waitress, had scraped together every penny for his education, believing in the American dream until their final breaths. Their deaths transformed the idealistic young Michael into a man obsessed with power and control, determined never to feel helpless again. His rise through Wall Street became legendary, a brutal ascension marked by hostile takeovers and strategic destructions. He earned the nickname the Terminator for his signature move, acquiring struggling hospitals and transforming them into profitable enterprises, regardless of the human cost. Just last month, he had orchestrated his most controversial acquisition, yet the purchase and immediate restructuring of Hope General Hospital, resulting in the termination of over 200 staff members. The media painted him as a monster, but Sterling saw himself as a necessary evil. Hospitals aren't charities, he often declared in board meetings. They're businesses, and businesses must be profitable. His philosophy had earned him enemies and admirers in equal measure, along with a fortune estimated at $4.2 billion. Yet success came at a personal price. His Manhattan penthouse, spanning 12,000 square feet of museum-like perfection, echoed with emptiness. 3 divorces had left him wary of emotional attachments, and his only companion was Winston, his elderly butler who had served the Sterling family for 4 decades. Even his recent 45th birthday celebration, a lavish gala attended by New York's elite, had felt like another business transaction. The latest controversy surrounding Sterling Industries centered on the closure of several rural healthcare facilities deemed unprofitable. Public outcry reached new heights when a former employee, David Thompson, took his own life after being terminated. The incident barely registered on Sterling's radar, just another casualty in the relentless pursuit of progress. Sterling's current project involved the acquisition of 5 struggling hospitals across the Northeast. His team had identified them as prime candidates for his signature efficiency improvements, staff reductions, service consolidations, and the elimination of unnecessary charitable programs. The board meeting scheduled for tomorrow would finalize the details, adding another chapter to his legacy of transformation through destruction. As he stood at his office window that stormy evening, watching lightning illuminate the city below, Sterling felt the familiar emptiness gnawing at his chest. The whiskey in his crystal glass, aged longer than some of his employees had been alive, offered no comfort. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from sycophants, rivals, and gold diggers, all wanting a piece of the empire he'd built. Little did he know that this night, this singular moment in time, would shatter the carefully constructed walls of his existence. The woman in the rain would force him to confront not just his past, but the very foundations of who he had become. For the first time since those dark days in the county hospital, Michael Sterling would face a choice that no amount of money could solve. But for now he remained the king of his glass castle, untouchable and alone, nursing his whiskey as the storm raged outside, a perfect metaphor for the tempest about to engulf his life. The ruthless billionaire who had sacrificed his humanity on the altar of success was about to receive a profound lesson in the true cost of wealth and the real meaning of value. Sarah Thompson's weathered hands trembled slightly as she read the terminal diagnosis for the third time, the harsh fluorescent lights of the clinic making the words seem even more stark and unforgiving. At 68, she had spent 45 years as a nurse, bringing thousands of babies into the world and comforting countless families through their darkest hours. Now, the pancreatic cancer diagnosis gave her less than 3 months to live, time she couldn't afford to spend on herself, not while her son needed her. Her tiny apartment in the Bronx bore witness to a life dedicated to others. The walls were covered with thank you cards from grateful families and photos of babies she had delivered, many now grown with children of their own. Among them, hidden in a tarnished silver frame, was a photograph that held her greatest secret, a newborn baby she had delivered on a stormy night in 1978, Michael Sterling, the son of factory workers who would become one of the world's wealthiest men. Sarah had never told anyone about her special connection to the Sterling family. She had been there the night young Michael was born, had witnessed the love and sacrifice of his parents, and had secretly followed his meteoric rise to power through newspaper clippings she kept in an old shoebox. She had watched from afar as the kind-hearted boy she once knew transformed into a corporate titan known for his ruthlessness. The irony of life's cruel twists wasn't lost on her. After decades of serving others, Sarah had depleted her savings caring for her son James after the accident that left him wheelchair-bound. The fire that had stolen his mobility had also robbed him of his promising career as a trauma surgeon. The bitter truth was that she couldn't afford the treatment that might extend her life, the same treatment available in the hospitals now owned by the very baby she had once cradled in her arms. Her small pension barely covered their basic needs, and the medication James required consumed what little they had left. She had sold nearly everything of value: her wedding ring, her late husband's watch, even her prized collection of vintage medical books. The only thing she refused to part with was that old photograph of baby Michael and the handwritten note his mother had given her: "Thank you for bringing our miracle into the world." Tonight's desperate journey through the storm wasn't for her own treatment. She had made peace with her fate. It was for James, who had developed a severe infection that threatened his life. The local clinic had turned them away, unable to provide the specialized care he needed. The nearest Sterling Industries hospital was their last hope, though they had no way to pay for treatment. Sarah kept her terminal diagnosis hidden from James, just as she concealed her growing weakness and constant pain. Her son had already lost too much: his career, his mobility, and his father. She couldn't bear to add to his burdens. Every morning she swallowed her pain medication in secret, forced a smile onto her face, and continued being the mother her son needed. The rain soaking through her thin jacket seemed fitting, a physical manifestation of the tears she refused to shed. Her arms ached from pushing James's wheelchair through the flooded streets, but she persevered. A lifetime of nursing had taught her that sometimes the darkest hours came just before dawn, and that miracles often arrived in unexpected ways. As headlights approached through the deluge, Sarah lifted her eyes in silent prayer. She had never asked for divine intervention for herself, but for James she would beg if necessary. The approaching vehicle was exactly the kind of luxury car she had seen Michael Sterling exit in newspaper photographs. Perhaps, she thought, the universe had a plan after all. Little did she know that this chance encounter would set in motion events that would not only save her son, but would also force her to confront her long-held secret. The baby she had helped bring into the world was about to cross paths with her again, though under circumstances she could never have imagined. The photo in its tarnished frame would soon become more than just a memory. It would become the key to understanding a story that began long before this stormy night. James Thompson's hands gripped the worn arms of his wheelchair as another wave of fever racked his body. At 35, his appearance bore little resemblance to the confident trauma surgeon he had been just 18 months ago. His once athletic frame had grown gaunt, his designer scrubs replaced by threadbare clothes, and his eyes, though still sharp with intelligence, now carried the weight of shattered dreams. Before the accident, he had been the rising star at Metropolitan General Hospital, known for performing miracle saves in the ER and volunteering countless hours at free clinics. His colleagues had nicknamed him Golden Hands Thompson for his surgical precision and unwavering dedication. That was before the fire at Hope Children's Home changed everything. He had rushed into the burning building 3 times, saving 7 children. On the 4th attempt, a collapsing beam had crushed his spine, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. The hospital, where he had saved countless lives, was now owned by Sterling Industries, the same corporation that had denied his disability claim, citing a technicality because the injury occurred off hospital grounds. The decision had left him and his mother financially devastated, forcing them to sell their house and move to a tiny apartment in the Bronx. His medical bills had depleted their savings, and the experimental treatments that might help him walk again remained frustratingly out of reach. What pained him most wasn't his paralysis, but watching his mother sacrifice everything for him. He noticed how she tried to hide her own declining health, how she skipped meals claiming she wasn't hungry, how she worked extra shifts at the free clinic despite her advancing age. James knew she was keeping something from him. He was a doctor after all, but every time he tried to discuss it, she deflected with the practiced skill of a lifetime caregiver. Tonight's infection wasn't his first, but it was certainly the worst. The fever clouded his thoughts, making it difficult to self-diagnose, but his medical training told him this was serious. They had already been turned away from 2 clinics, and now his mother was pushing his wheelchair through a storm to reach Sterling Memorial Hospital, the flagship of the very corporation that had abandoned him. Few knew that James had a deeper connection to Sterling Industries. His older brother David had been a senior administrator at one of their hospitals before being terminated in Michael Sterling's latest efficiency purge. David's subsequent suicide had made headlines briefly before being buried under newer scandals. James had never told his mother that he had received David's final email, detailing corruption within Sterling Industries and hinting at devastating secrets about the company's practices. Despite everything, James hadn't lost his compassion. Even now, he volunteered at the free clinic when his health permitted, offering medical consultations to those who couldn't afford care. His patients often joked that he was the only doctor who truly understood their struggles, both as a physician and as someone the system had failed. The fever made the rain feel like ice needles on his skin, but he remained silent, knowing his mother was already pushing herself beyond her limits. He watched her struggle against the wind, her thin frame barely visible in the darkness. A familiar anger rose in his chest, not at his condition, but at a healthcare system that forced a 68-year-old woman to push her sick son through a storm because they couldn't afford an ambulance. As the sleek black Bentley approached through the rain, James felt a strange mix of hope and bitterness. The car represented everything wrong with the system: wealth, privilege, indifference. Yet at this moment it might be their only chance at help. He had no way of knowing that the man inside was Michael Sterling himself, or that this encounter would unravel a web of connections that would change all their lives forever. The fever was getting worse, and James could feel consciousness slipping away. His last coherent thought was of his brother's final words: "Sometimes the truth finds its own way into the light." As the Bentley's headlights illuminated them in the storm, that truth was about to begin its journey to the surface, though none of them could have predicted the price it would demand or the healing it would ultimately bring. Lightning crackled across Manhattan's skyline as Michael Sterling's Bentley slowed to a crawl through the flooded street. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge, creating a hypnotic rhythm that matched his whiskey-dulled thoughts. Through the distorted glass, he saw them, an elderly woman in a rain-soaked cardigan pushing a wheelchair through water that reached halfway up its wheels. The man in the chair was slumped forward, clearly ill, his dark hair plastered to his face by the relentless rain. Sterling's finger hovered over the window control. 20 years of calculated indifference warred with something deeper, a forgotten echo of humanity. The woman looked directly at him, her eyes carrying a quiet dignity that pierced through the expensive glass separating their worlds. In that moment, she reminded him of someone, though the whiskey made the memory elusive. Sir Winston's voice came from the driver's seat, heavy with unspoken meaning. The elderly butler had served the Sterling family long enough to recognize the rare moments when his employer's mask cracked. "Shall I stop?" Before Sterling could respond, the man in the wheelchair began convulsing. The woman's cry of distress cut through the storm's fury, rising above the thunder. Her desperate attempt to stabilize the wheelchair in the rising water created a scene that would haunt Sterling's dreams for years to come. "Stop the car." Winston, the words left his mouth before he could reconsider. As the Bentley's brake lights reflected off the flood water, Sterling found himself stepping into the rain for the first time since his last parents' funeral. His Italian leather shoes were instantly submerged, his $12,000 suit soaked through. "Please," the woman's voice trembled with exhaustion and fear. "My son needs help. We've been turned away from 2 clinics already." He's burning with fever. Her hands, Sterling noticed, were raw and bleeding from gripping the wheelchair's handles in the cold. The sick man lifted his head slightly, and Sterling felt an uncomfortable jolt of recognition. Something in the man's features triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. The fever had left him delirious, but his eyes held the same quiet dignity as his mother's. "Sterling Memorial is just 8 blocks away," the woman continued, unaware she was addressing the hospital's owner. "If we could just get a ride," she swayed slightly, clearly at the end of her strength. Thunder crashed overhead as Sterling made a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. Winston helped get them into the car. The butler was already moving, his efficient actions belying his age. As they maneuvered the wheelchair toward the Bentley's trunk, Sterling found himself supporting the elderly woman, feeling how badly she was shaking. Inside the car, the contrast between worlds became startlingly clear. The woman's threadbare cardigan dripped onto hand-stitched leather worth more than most people's monthly salary. Her son's fevered breathing fogged the climate-controlled air. Sterling noticed how she tried to make herself smaller, as if attempting to minimize the space she occupied in this realm of luxury. "I'm Sarah," she offered quietly, her hand never leaving her son's shoulder. "This is James. We've been trying to reach the hospital for hours." Her voice carried no self-pity, only determination. Sterling watched as she wiped her son's forehead with her damp sleeve, her movements carrying the practiced efficiency of someone used to caring for others. In the dim light, he caught a glimpse of a small silver pendant around her neck, a caduceus, the symbol of medical service. "Michael," he responded, omitting his surname. Something held him back from revealing his identity, an instinct he didn't quite understand. As Winston navigated through the flooded streets toward Sterling Memorial Hospital, none of them could have known they were heading not just toward medical care, but toward a collision of past and present that would shake the foundations of everything they believed to be true. The storm raged on outside, but inside the Bentley, the real tempest was just beginning to form. The Bentley's interior remained unnaturally silent as they navigated through Manhattan's flooded streets, broken only by James's labored breathing and the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers. Sarah's weathered hands never left her son's shoulder, each subtle tremor in his body sending fresh waves of anxiety through her. The fever was climbing, she could tell without needing a thermometer, drawing on decades of nursing experience. Their first stop, Mercy Clinic in the Bronx, had turned them away with apologetic smiles and mumblings about liability issues. The second clinic had been more direct: no insurance, no treatment. Each rejection had cost precious time, and Sarah could feel James slipping further away with each passing minute. The cruel irony that her son, once a brilliant surgeon who had saved countless lives, might now die because of bureaucratic indifference, threatened to overwhelm her. Michael Sterling watched the unfolding drama from his seat, an unfamiliar discomfort growing in his chest. The woman's quiet dignity in the face of desperation stirred something he'd long buried. Through the rain-streaked windows, he saw the illuminated sign of Sterling Memorial Hospital growing closer, and for the first time in years he felt shame at seeing his family name in lights. "Turn left here," Winston he instructed, knowing the emergency entrance would be blocked by flooding. "We use the private entrance." The word surprised even him that entrance was reserved for VIP patients and board members, not waterlogged charity cases picked up in a storm. Suddenly James's body went rigid, his breathing becoming more erratic. Sarah's professional calm cracked slightly. "He's getting worse." The infection spreading her voice carried the weight of both medical knowledge and maternal anguish. "We need antibiotics now." Sterling found himself reaching for his phone, then stopping. One call from him would mobilize the hospital's entire staff, but something held him back. The moment he revealed his identity, everything would change. This simple act of humanity would become another headline, another PR opportunity, another transaction. As they pulled up to the private entrance, 2 security guards approached the car. Sterling could see the moment of hesitation in their faces, the clear conflict between their training to assist the luxury vehicle's occupants and their instinct to stop the bedraggled passengers from entering the pristine facility. "Sir," one guard began, "this entrance is reserved for." "Bear with me," Sterling cut him off, his tone carrying 2 decades of command. The guard's objection died in his throat, though his expression betrayed his confusion at seeing the infamous Michael Sterling in a soaked designer suit, accompanying what appeared to be charity cases. Getting James's wheelchair out of the car proved challenging. The storm had intensified and Sarah's exhaustion was evident in her trembling hands. Sterling found himself helping, his own hands unused to such physical labor, yet driven by an urgency he didn't quite understand. Inside, the hospital's bright lights threw their situation into stark relief. Sarah's cardigan was more threadbare than he'd realized, and James's fever-flushed face carried traces of the distinguished surgeon he'd once been. The pristine hallway stretched before them, its polished floors reflecting their bedraggled group like some sort of surreal painting, wealth and poverty, power and helplessness, all thrown together by chance and nature's fury. Yet Sterling knew it wasn't really chance. Something about these people this night felt like destiny disguised as coincidence. As they moved toward the emergency department, he caught sight of his own portrait hanging on the wall, the official photo of the hospital's owner, looking down at them with the cold confidence of wealth and power. The contrast between that image and his current reality struck him like a physical blow. They were about to cross a threshold, both literal and metaphorical, and Sterling had the distinct feeling that once they did, nothing would ever be the same. The emergency department of Sterling Memorial Hospital hummed with efficiency and privilege, its marble floors and modern art installations more reminiscent of a luxury hotel than a place of healing. As their unlikely group approached the reception desk, the stark fluorescent lights revealed what the dim car interior had hidden. James's condition was deteriorating rapidly, his skin taking on a dangerous grey pallor. The receptionist's professionally neutral expression flickered when she saw them, a sodden group led by a man she instantly recognized from the portrait in the lobby, though she tried to hide her shock. "I'll need insurance information and payment method before we can proceed," she recited automatically, then faltered as Sterling's ice-blue eyes fixed on her. Before he could speak, Sarah stepped forward, decades of nursing experience evident in her stance. "His temperature is at least 104, blood pressure dropping, possible sepsis from an underlying infection. He needs immediate IV antibiotics and fluid resuscitation." The clinical precision of her assessment contrasted sharply with her rain-soaked appearance. A young resident approached, drawn by the commotion. His eyes widened as he recognized Sterling, then narrowed professionally as he took in James's condition. "Get him to Bay 3, he ordered, then hesitated. "Sir, regarding the financial arrangements." "Treat him." Sterling's voice cut through the air like a blade. The single command carried enough authority to set the emergency department into motion, though he could see the questions forming in everyone's eyes. He wasn't known for acts of charity, quite the opposite. As the medical team transferred James to a treatment bed, Sarah never left his side, quietly relaying his medical history to the staff. Sterling watched her movements, efficient, professional, clearly someone who had spent her life in hospitals. Something about her manner tugged at his memory again, more insistent this time. The resident's voice cut through his thoughts. "Sir, preliminary tests suggest severe sepsis. He'll need specialized antibiotics, possibly ICU care." The young doctor's eyes darted between Sterling and his patient, clearly struggling to reconcile this situation with the hospital's usual protocols. Sterling noticed Sarah's slight flinch at the mention of ICU. She clearly understood the financial implications. In that moment, he saw his own mother's face the night they were told his father needed specialized care they couldn't afford. The memory hit him with unexpected force. A nurse approached with admission forms, holding them uncertainly. The papers represented everything. Sterling had built his empire on the bureaucracy of healing, the business of hope. Standard procedures designed to protect the hospital's interests, procedures he himself had implemented and ruthlessly enforced. Through the glass partition, he could see the medical team working on James, their movements urgent but precise. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, her hand resting lightly on her son's foot, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. The scene struck him as both foreign and achingly familiar. So the nurse was still waiting with the forms. Sterling reached for them mechanically, but stopped as he caught sight of Sarah's silver caduceus pendant again. Something about it seemed important, like a key to a lock he didn't know needed opening. The memory it triggered remained just out of reach, but its presence felt significant. The monitors around James began beeping more urgently, and Sterling made a decision that would set in motion events he couldn't possibly foresee. "Treat him," he repeated, pushing the forms away. "Treat him like he was family." A mother pushing a wheelchair through the storm, fighting against all odds, yet her story remains unliked. Will you be the first to recognize such extraordinary love? In the sterile quiet of the hospital's private waiting room, Michael Sterling stood before the window, watching the storm rage against the glass. The events of the night had left him unsettled, like pieces of a puzzle refusing to align. As he loosened his wet tie, a news alert flashed on his phone, another article criticizing his recent hospital acquisitions. The headline mentioned David Thompson's suicide, and suddenly the pieces began to fall into place. The resemblance he'd noticed earlier, James Thompson's features matched the photograph in the suicide report. The same determined jaw, the same penetrating gaze. David Thompson, the administrator who had taken his own life after Sterling Industries' latest optimization initiative, had a brother who was a surgeon. Sterling's hands tightened around his phone as the implications washed over him. His thoughts were interrupted by Sarah's return from James's bedside. She looked exhausted, her wet clothes still clinging to her small frame. As she sank into one of the leather chairs, something fell from her worn purse, a weathered envelope, its contents spilling across the floor. Sterling moved to help her collect the scattered papers, but froze when he saw what they were. Hospital bills. Rejection letters from insurance companies. A termination notice from Metropolitan General, now a Sterling Industries property. But it was the photograph that stopped his breath, a younger Sarah in a nurse's uniform, holding a newborn baby. The date on the back, March 15th, 1978, his birthday. "You were there," he whispered, the memory finally crystallizing. "The night I was born." Sarah's eyes met his, a lifetime of secrets reflecting in their depths. "I was wondering if you'd recognize me, Mr. Sterling." Her voice was soft but steady. "Your mother was in labor for 18 hours. Your father never left her side, even though he'd worked a double shift at the factory. They were so proud, so full of hope." Sterling sank into the chair opposite her, the weight of recognition pressing against his chest. "You were the nurse who saved me. There were complications." The story had been told to him many times during his childhood, how a quick-thinking nurse had noticed the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck, how her swift action had prevented tragedy. "Your mother wrote to me every Christmas until she passed," Sarah continued, pulling out a carefully preserved letter from her purse. "She wanted you to have the best of everything. She believed you would do great things." The unspoken judgment in those words hung heavy in the air. Thunder crashed outside as Sarah's composure finally cracked. "I watched you build your empire, Michael. Watched you transform hospitals into profit centers. The same hospitals that turned my sons away. Yes, sons. David was my firstborn." Her voice broke on his name. "He tried to fight your policies from the inside, tried to protect the patients. The night we lost him, he called James. Said he couldn't live with what he'd discovered about Sterling Industries." The irony was devastating. The woman who had given him his first breath of life was now before him, broken by the very system he'd built. Sterling felt the carefully constructed walls of his worldview beginning to crumble. Sarah pulled out one final document, her own medical records. "Life has a strange way of coming full circle, Mr. Sterling. I have terminal cancer, diagnosed 3 months ago. The treatment I need is available in your hospitals, but—" She smiled bitterly. "I can't afford it. Every penny I have goes to keeping James alive." Sterling stared at the medical report, his vision blurring. The same aggressive cancer that had taken his mother was now claiming the woman who had saved his life. The cosmic cruelty of it struck him like a physical blow. A nurse appeared at the door, her face grave. "Mrs. Thompson, your son's condition is critical. We need your consent for emergency surgery." She hesitated, glancing at Sterling. "There's also the matter of financial responsibility." Sarah stood, her dignity intact, despite her trembling hands. "How much time do we have?" "Without immediate intervention, hours at most." Sterling watched as Sarah squared her shoulders, preparing to fight yet another battle for her child's life. In that moment he saw his own mother's determination, remembered her final days in a county hospital because they couldn't afford better care. The weight of 2 decades of choices pressed down on him like a physical force. The storm outside had reached its peak, but the real tempest was just beginning in Michael Sterling's soul. The hospital boardroom buzzed with tension as emergency notifications lit up smartphones across the mahogany table. Board members had been summoned at this ungodly hour, their faces on the video conference screen reflecting confusion and irritation. Richard Maxwell, the chief financial officer, stood before the assembled group, his expression grave as he delivered the news that would ignite a firestorm. "Mr. Sterling has authorized full treatment for an indigent patient, bypassing all standard procedures. The estimated costs could exceed $2 million." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "The patient is James Thompson, brother of David Thompson." The name sent a ripple through the room. Everyone remembered the PR nightmare of David Thompson's suicide, the media frenzy that had followed. Margaret Chen, head of legal, leaned forward. "This could be seen as an admission of guilt. If we provide special treatment to the family of a former employee who committed suicide after our restructuring." "It's worse," Maxwell continued. "Local news already has wind of it. They're running with the angle that the mighty Michael Sterling was seen helping a destitute family in the storm. Social media is exploding with comparisons to his recent hospital closures." Outside the boardroom, protesters had begun gathering despite the weather. Their chants echoed faintly through the reinforced windows. "Healthcare is a right, not a privilege." Signs bearing David Thompson's face appeared among the crowd, illuminated by the lightning that still split the sky. Sterling sat silently at the head of the table, His wetsuit, now dried but wrinkled, a physical representation of his usually impeccable facade cracking. The weight of Sarah's revelations pressed against his chest, competing with 2 decades of business instincts. Our shareholders will have questions, Maxwell pressed on. We're in the middle of negotiating the largest hospital acquisition in our history. This kind of publicity, this deviation from policy, it could jeopardize everything we've built. Jennifer Torres, the youngest board member and head of community relations, spoke up, or it could be an opportunity. The public's perception of Sterling Industries has been at an all-time low. This could humanize us, show that we're more than just profit margins. Sentimentality is what destroys healthcare systems, Margaret countered. We maintain standards for a reason. If we make an exception here, where do we draw the line? Every sob story will expect the same treatment. The debate raged on as Sterling's phone buzzed with a message from the emergency department. James's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Without immediate surgery, his chances would drop dramatically. The cost of the procedure alone would equal the annual profit of a small clinic. Another message flashed, this one from his PR team. They had drafted 2 press releases, one highlighting Sterling Industries' compassionate response to a family in crisis, another distancing the company from any special treatment implications. They needed his decision within the hour. There's also the matter of Sarah Thompson's condition, Maxwell added quietly. Our sources say she has terminal cancer. Treatment at this stage would be financially inadvisable. The room fell silent as the full weight of the situation settled over them. This wasn't just about one emergency surgery, it was about setting precedents, about the very nature of their business model. Sterling thought of Sarah's weathered hands, of the photograph of his birth, of his mother's final days in a county hospital. The media is calling it the Storm Night miracle, Jennifer reported, scrolling through her tablet. They're asking if this represents a change in Sterling Industries' approach to healthcare. Mr. Sterling, we need your guidance. Do we embrace this narrative or shut it down? Through the boardroom windows, Sterling could see the growing crowd of protesters. Among them, a young woman held a sign that hit him like a physical blow. My father died because your hospital turned him away. The empire he'd built stood at a crossroads. Every business instinct told him to distance himself from this situation, to protect the billion-dollar deals in progress. Yet Sarah's words echoed in his mind. Your mother believed you would do great things. Not profitable things, great things. His phone buzzed again. The surgical team was waiting for authorization. In the emergency department, a mother who had once saved his life waited to learn if her son would live or die. The decision he made in the next few moments would ripple far beyond this stormy night, affecting not just the Thompson family, but the very foundation of Sterling Industries. The board members waited, watching their leader wrestle with a choice that would define not just his legacy, but his humanity. Outside, the storm raged on, nature itself seeming to hold its breath for his decision. Michael Sterling rose from the boardroom table, his movements silencing the heated debate around him. For the first time in his career, his next words weren't calculated for maximum profit or strategic advantage. Proceed with both surgeries, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of finality. James Thompson's emergency procedure and Sarah Thompson's cancer treatment. Full coverage, best available care. Margaret Chen's sharp intake of breath cut through the silence. Michael, the precedent this sets is exactly what we need, Sterling interrupted, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. 20 years ago, I watched my parents die because they couldn't afford proper health care. I built this empire promising myself no one would have that power over me again. Somewhere along the way, I became what I hated most. He moved to the window, watching the protesters below. The storm had transformed their signs into bleeding watercolors, but their determination remained undiminished. Among them, he spotted a nurse who looked remarkably like Sarah in her younger years, same compassionate eyes, same unwavering dedication. Draft a new press release, he continued, turning back to the stunned board. Sterling Industries is announcing a comprehensive review of all our healthcare policies. Effective immediately, we're establishing the Thompson Memorial Fund for underprivileged patients. Initial funding $50 million. Maxwell's face drained of color. The shareholders will adapt or leave Sterling, cut him off. I own controlling interest. This isn't a discussion, it's a notification. He pulled out his phone, displaying Sarah's medical records. This woman saved my life the night I was born. While we sit here debating profit margins, she's dying of the same cancer that took my mother because she can't afford our treatments. If that doesn't show you everything wrong with our system, nothing will. Jennifer Torres was already typing furiously on her tablet, her eyes bright with possibility. We can have the framework for the fund ready by morning. This could revolutionize our entire approach to healthcare accessibility. The boardroom erupted in overlapping voices, protests, suggestions, warnings. Sterling silenced them with a raised hand. I'm going down to the emergency department to personally authorize these procedures. When I return, I expect to see proposals for implementing these changes across all our facilities. As he strode toward the door, Margaret called out, "Michael, wait. The liability implications alone." He paused at the threshold. 20 years ago, a nurse named Sarah Thompson worked an extra shift because she believed every patient deserved care. She saved a baby boy who grew up to become everything his parents feared, not a force for good, but a barrier to healing. Tonight we change that narrative. The elevator ride to the emergency department felt like a descent into his own past. Each floor pinged past like a year stripped away, bringing him closer to the person he might have been, should have been. When the doors opened, he heard Sarah's voice before he saw her, soft but clear. "Just hold on, James. Help is coming." She looked up as Sterling approached, reading his expression with the skill of a lifetime spent assessing patients. For a moment, neither spoke, the beeping of medical monitors filling the silence. "Both procedures are approved," he said finally. "Yours too. Full coverage." Sarah's hand flew to her throat, clutching the caduceus pendant. "Mr. Sterling, I didn't tell you about that night too." "I know," he interrupted gently. "You never asked for anything, did you? Not the night you saved me, not tonight. That's about to change." He turned to the waiting medical team. "These patients are to receive your absolute best care, whatever they need, whenever they need it." The head surgeon nodded, already calling his team into action. As they wheeled James toward the operating room, Sarah squeezed her son's hand one last time. Sterling watched the interaction, seeing in it every sacrifice his own mother had made, every principle he'd abandoned in his pursuit of power. "Mrs. Thompson," he called as she turned to follow the gurney. "Thank you. Not just for tonight, and not just for that night. Thank you for showing me what real healthcare should look like." She smiled, and for a moment he saw her as she'd been in that old photograph, young, dedicated, believing in the power of healing above all else. "Your mother would be proud of this moment, Michael." As the doors closed behind them, Sterling felt the weight of 20 years of decisions lifting from his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring challenges, shareholders to appease, policies to rewrite, an empire to transform. But for now, in this moment, he was simply a man choosing to do what was right, guided by the long-ago kindness of a nurse who believed in miracles. The operating room at Sterling Memorial Hospital hummed with focused energy as the surgical team prepared for James Thompson's procedure. Through the observation window, Michael Sterling watched the choreographed precision of medical professionals at work, their movements carrying none of the hesitation that had plagued the administrative decisions hours earlier. Dr. Catherine Rivera, the hospital's top infectious disease specialist, had been pulled from her daughter's piano recital for this case. Her reputation for handling complex cases made her the obvious choice, though no one mentioned that her own father had been turned away from a Sterling facility last year. She worked with methodical efficiency, her personal feelings buried beneath years of professional training. Multiple organ systems are compromised, she reported, her voice clear through the intercom. The infection has spread more aggressively than initial scans suggested. Her eyes met Sterling's through the glass, silently communicating the gravity of the situation. This would be more complicated and more expensive than anyone had anticipated. Sarah Thompson sat in the waiting area, her own pre-treatment tests temporarily forgotten as she focused on her son's surgery. Sterling noticed how the other waiting families gave her space, perhaps sensing the weight of her vigil. The story had already spread through the hospital, the mysterious woman in wet clothes who had brought the mighty Michael Sterling to his knees with nothing but the truth. Local news vans had begun gathering outside despite the ongoing storm, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like modern prayers. Sterling's phone buzzed constantly with updates from his PR team. The story was going viral. Storm Night Miracle was trending nationwide, accompanied by thousands of similar stories: families bankrupted by medical bills, lives lost to corporate policies, healthcare dreams shattered by financial realities. Inside the ore, James's vital signs fluctuated dangerously. Dr. Rivera called for additional blood products, her calm voice belying the urgency of the situation. The cost meter in Sterling's head, the one that had guided 2 decades of business decisions, ticked upward with each intervention. He forced himself to ignore it, focusing instead on Sarah's quiet strength as she waited. Hospital staff moved differently now, watching their owner watch the surgery. Many had been there during previous optimization rounds, had seen colleagues dismissed and services cut. The contrast between that Sterling and this one, the man who stood vigil with a patient's family, created a ripple of whispered conversations throughout the facility. Hours passed. The storm outside gradually weakened, but the tension in the hospital corridors remained electric. More people arrived: nurses who had worked with James before his accident, former patients he had treated, even protesters who had traded their signs for prayers. The waiting room became a microcosm of everything healthcare should be: humans supporting humans, regardless of status or wealth. Dr. Rivera emerged from the ore during hour 5, her surgical mask hanging loose around her neck. "We've managed to isolate the primary infection site," she reported, addressing both Sterling and Sarah. "But there's a complication. We found evidence of an underlying condition that requires specialized treatment that until tonight was only approved for our premium care patients." Sterling felt the weight of every policy he'd ever implemented pressed down on him. "Do whatever's necessary," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "No restrictions." Sarah's oncologist arrived as dawn broke, carrying her test results. The cancer had progressed further than her initial diagnosis suggested, a tragic consequence of delayed treatment. As the doctor outlined her treatment options, Sterling recognized the familiar dance of medical professionals trying to balance hope with financial reality. The most effective treatment protocol would be, the oncologist began. Approved, Sterling interrupted, along with any supplementary therapies she might need. The news spread through the hospital like a healing wave. Nurses who had spent years watching patients choose between medicine and food wept openly. Administrative staff who had been forced to deny care based on payment status started pulling files of similar cases, hope blooming for the first time in years. By morning, the story had evolved beyond a simple rescue in a storm. Sterling transformation competed with healthcare justice for trending status. Videos of Sarah's history as a nurse surfaced, along with testimonials from countless lives she had touched. Someone had found footage of James running into the burning children's home, transforming him from a charity case into a hero in the public's eye. Sterling watched it all unfold from his position near the ore window, his usual command of situations replaced by something more profound: the understanding that he was witnessing not just medical procedures, but the resurrection of his own humanity. The empire he had built on efficiency and profit was being transformed by compassion and necessity. Dr. Rivera emerged again, exhaustion evident in her stance but satisfaction in her eyes. "He's stabilizing," she announced. The next 24 hours will be critical, but I believe we've turned the corner." Sarah's tears of relief were echoed throughout the waiting room. Sterling felt something crack inside his chest, not the shattering of his business model, but the breaking of chains he hadn't known he carried. Every face in that waiting room reflected back to him what healthcare could be, should be, must be. As the sun rose over Manhattan, painting the hospital windows in shades of gold, Sterling made another decision. This one came not from business acumen or PR strategy, but from the place where his mother's values had lain dormant for 20 years. He reached for his phone, not to check stock prices or board reactions, but to begin drafting a new mission statement for Sterling Industries. The night storm had washed away more than just debris from the streets. It had cleared a path forward, illuminated by the strength of a mother's love and the long-ago kindness of a nurse who had believed in the value of every life. The days following the storm night miracle brought changes that rippled through Sterling Memorial Hospital like waves in a still pond. Michael Sterling, the man once known as the Terminator of healthcare, became a fixture in the ICU waiting room. His bespoke suits gave way to casual clothes, his commanding presence softened by sleepless nights and soul-searching conversations with Sarah Thompson. Hospital staff watched in amazement as their feared CEO helped elderly patients navigate the corridors, sat with worried families, and actually listened to frontline workers' concerns. The man who had once fired an administrator for suggesting more charitable care now spent hours with the hospital's financial counselors, reviewing cases of patients struggling with medical debt. Sarah's influence on Sterling grew more apparent daily. Between her chemotherapy sessions, she shared stories of her nursing career, tales of lives saved, hands held, and dignity preserved in the face of death. Her perspective on healthcare, formed through decades of direct patient care, began to reshape Sterling's understanding of his own empire. "Medicine isn't just about treating illness," she told him one evening, her voice weak from treatment but her conviction strong. "It's about treating people. Every policy, every procedure, every financial decision affects someone's mother, father, child." That's what David tried to tell you before she didn't need to finish the sentence. The weight of her lost son's suicide hung between them like a shadow. The transformation wasn't limited to Sterling. Hospital staff, initially skeptical of their CEO's apparent change of heart, began to witness genuine shifts in policy. Dr. Rivera, who had operated on James, found herself appointed to a new patient advocacy board. Administrative staff were empowered to make compassionate exceptions to payment rules. The entire culture of the hospital began to pivot from profit first to patient first. James Thompson's recovery became a symbol of this transformation. As he regained strength, his room turned into an unofficial meeting place where doctors, nurses, and administrators gathered to discuss reforms. His experience as both a surgeon and a patient provided unique insights into the system's flaws and potential solutions. "We need to remember why we chose medicine," James said during one such gathering, his voice still weak but growing stronger. "It wasn't for the profit margins or stockholder returns. It was to heal, to help, to make a difference." Sterling, listening from the doorway, felt each word like a personal challenge to his past decisions. The media seized upon the story with unprecedented enthusiasm. Headlines evolved from Billionaire's Night of Charity to Sterling Industries, a healthcare revolution. Journalists tracked down former patients who had been denied care, contrasting their stories with the new policies being implemented. Some board members resigned in protest, but their departures were overshadowed by the overwhelming public support for the changes. Sarah's chemotherapy journey became intertwined with the hospital's transformation. Staff who had once feared budget cuts now volunteered to cover extra shifts in the oncology ward. Sterling found himself learning the names and stories of employees he would have previously seen as mere numbers on a spreadsheet. Each interaction, each shared moment of humanity, chipped away at the walls he'd built around his heart. One morning, Sterling arrived to find Sarah teaching a young nurse the proper technique for comforting distressed patients. Despite her own illness, she continued to share her wisdom, to nurture the kind of compassionate care that had defined her career. The scene stopped him in his tracks. Here was the essence of healthcare, the human connection that no spreadsheet could quantify. Jennifer Torres, the board member who had supported the initial changes, worked tirelessly to document and expand the reforms. "What's happening here isn't just good PR," she reported during a staff meeting. "Patient satisfaction is up, staff turnover is down, and our community engagement metrics are breaking records. We're proving that compassionate care can coexist with financial stability." The changes weren't without challenges. Some shareholders threatened lawsuits, claiming breach of fiduciary duty. Conservative pundits accused Sterling of surrendering to socialism. Yet for every critic, there seemed to be a dozen supporters, patients whose lives were changed, families who found hope, communities that began to see Sterling Memorial not as a corporate monolith, but as a place of healing. Sterling found himself sharing meals in the hospital cafeteria, listening to stories from janitors, technicians, and nurses. Each conversation revealed another facet of healthcare he had overlooked in his pursuit of profit. The woman who cleaned the ICU spoke of holding patients' hands when family couldn't be present. The parking attendant described helping elderly visitors navigate the garage at night. These small acts of humanity, multiplied across thousands of interactions, defined the true purpose of a hospital. As Sarah's treatment progressed and James continued to recover, Sterling felt himself awakening from a 20-year spell of cold efficiency. The numbers still mattered. Hospitals needed to remain solvent to serve their communities, but they no longer drove every decision. The balance he had dismissed as impossible now seemed not just achievable but essential. "You're becoming the man your mother always believed you could be," Sarah told him one evening, her careful fingers adjusting his crooked tie before a board meeting. The simple, maternal gesture brought tears to his eyes that no hostile takeover or billion-dollar deal had ever inspired. The transformation of Michael Sterling and his hospital became a case study in healthcare ethics courses, but for those who witnessed it firsthand, it was simply the story of a man rediscovering his humanity, guided by a nurse who had never lost faith in the healing power of compassion. As autumn crept into winter, new challenges emerged that threatened to unravel Sterling's healthcare revolution. A consortium of major shareholders, led by venture capitalist Robert Blackwood, filed a class action lawsuit claiming Sterling's reforms constituted a breach of fiduciary duty. The legal documents arrived on the same morning Sarah Thompson's latest test results showed her cancer had spread despite aggressive treatment. "Your responsibility is to maximize shareholder value," Blackwood's voice crackled through the speakerphone during an emergency board meeting. "This misguided attempt at charity has already cost us hundreds of millions in market capitalization. The Thompson Memorial Fund is bleeding money, and these new compassionate care policies are unsustainable." Sterling sat at his desk, Sarah's latest scan results in one hand and the lawsuit papers in the other. The contrast between the two documents crystallized everything wrong with the system he had helped build. Through his office window, he could see the growing line of patients outside the hospital's new charitable care clinic, people who just months ago would have been turned away. The media narrative began to shift. "Sterling Industries compassion or collapse," read one headline. Financial analysts predicted doom, suggesting the company's new policies would lead to bankruptcy within a year. Conservative talk shows branded Sterling a traitor to capitalism, while progressive critics argued his reforms were mere window dressing on a fundamentally broken system. James Thompson's recovery had plateaued, complicated by secondary infections that the hospital's most expensive treatments couldn't seem to resolve. His room on the rehabilitation floor became a lightning rod for both supporters and critics of Sterling's reforms. Every setback in his treatment was scrutinized, every additional expense questioned. "They're using my son as ammunition against you," Sarah observed one evening, her voice thin from her own treatments but her eyes sharp as ever, just like they used David's death to protect their profits. She held up a newspaper featuring side-by-side photos of her son's David's suicide scene and James in his hospital bed. The pressure mounted from multiple directions. Insurance companies began refusing to work with Sterling facilities, claiming the new policies violated their contractual agreements. Medical equipment suppliers raised their prices, sensing vulnerability. Even some doctors threatened to leave, worried about the institution's financial stability. Sterling found himself fighting battles on every front. Each morning brought new challenges, staff concerns about job security, media requests for comment on the lawsuit, protests both for and against the reforms. The weight of it pressed down on him, making him question whether one person could really change a system designed to prioritize profit over people. In the midst of this storm, Sarah's condition worsened. The expensive treatments that Sterling had promised seemed to be failing, and her oncologist recommended an experimental therapy not covered by any insurance plan. The cost would be astronomical, exactly the kind of financially inadvisable care his old policies had been designed to prevent. The board will see it as a direct provocation, Jennifer Torres warned during a late-night strategy session, approving an experimental treatment for the very patient who inspired these reforms. Blackwood will use it as evidence that you're making emotional decisions rather than rational ones. Sterling walked the hospital corridors that night, wrestling with the decision. He passed the wall where David Thompson's suicide note had once hung, now replaced by a memorial plaque honoring healthcare workers who had put patients before profits. In the ICU, he watched families huddled around bedsides, their hopes hanging on the very policies his shareholders were trying to dismantle. The lawsuit's preliminary hearing was scheduled for the same day as Sarah's next round of treatment. As if orchestrated by fate, James developed complications that required another surgery, creating a perfect storm of financial and emotional challenges. Each case represented a test of Sterling's new principles, a chance to either stand firm or retreat to the safety of his old ways. Anonymous sources within the hospital began leaking documents to the press, internal memos showing the real cost of the reforms, financial projections suggesting impending doom. Sterling recognized the handwriting of trust fund kids he'd hired fresh from business school, people who saw healthcare as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Sarah, despite her weakening condition, remained a source of strength. Your mother faced these same choices, she reminded him. Every extra shift she worked, every bill she couldn't pay, every sacrifice she made, it was all about putting care before cost. The system broke her body, but never her spirit. The complexity of running a compassionate healthcare system within a profit-driven market became increasingly apparent. Sterling found himself navigating impossible choices: which treatments to subsidize, which departments needed resources most, how to balance urgent needs against long-term sustainability. Late one night, as he reviewed the latest legal briefs, Sterling received a video call from a small clinic in rural Ohio. A young doctor there had implemented his reforms without corporate approval, providing care to uninsured patients. The clinic's success story offered a glimmer of hope, proof that his vision could work on a smaller scale. But it also highlighted the enormity of the challenge. Changing one hospital was difficult enough, transforming an entire healthcare system seemed almost impossible. As winter deepened, Sterling found himself at a crossroads. The lawyers offered a compromise: resign as CEO, let the reforms be gradually rolled back, keep his personal wealth intact. The alternative was to fight against the shareholders, the insurance companies, the entire healthcare industrial complex, with no guarantee of victory. In his pocket, he carried the photograph of the night he was born, Sarah's young face beaming with the pure joy of helping bring new life into the world. The image reminded him that every policy, every financial decision, every corporate strategy ultimately came down to a simple choice: prioritize profits or prioritize people. The complications were mounting, the pressure increasing from all sides. But somewhere in the storm of legal threats and financial challenges, Sterling began to understand that the real test wasn't about saving his company, it was about saving his soul. The crisis struck at 3 a.m. on a bitter December morning, when James Thompson's vital signs suddenly plummeted. Dr. Rivera's voice over the intercom carried an urgency that sent Sterling running from his makeshift office in the hospital's administrative wing. Multiple organ failure. We need to move him to advanced life support immediately. Sarah, weakened by her own latest round of chemotherapy, gripped the ICU observation window as the team worked on her son. Her thin fingers traced the glass, following the movements of the medical staff as they fought to stabilize him. The experimental cancer treatment had depleted her strength, but nothing could keep her from her vigil. His immune system is completely compromised, Dr. Rivera explained, her surgical mask hiding her expression but not the concern in her voice. The infection has mutated, becoming resistant to our strongest antibiotics. We need to try an experimental treatment protocol, but the cost. She hesitated, knowing the board was watching every financial decision with predatory attention. Sterling didn't hesitate. Do it. Whatever he needs. Mr. Sterling, his CFO's voice crackled through his phone. The shareholders' meeting is in 4 hours. This additional treatment will push us past the fiscal red line they've drawn. They'll use it to force an emergency board vote. Through the window, Sterling watched the medical team work. Each movement was a choreographed effort to preserve life, each decision carrying the weight of both medical necessity and financial consequence. The monitors beeped with increasing urgency, each sound a reminder of the battle between commerce and compassion. Sarah's quiet voice cut through the chaos. He's showing the same symptoms David had near the end. The words hung in the air like smoke. Before we lost him, David tried to expose something about the hospital's drug protocols. He said certain treatments were being withheld, not based on medical necessity, but on profit margins. Sterling felt the impact of her words like a physical blow. He had personally approved those protocols, had praised their efficiency in board meetings. How many lives had been balanced against bottom lines? How many families had faced moments like this, watching loved ones slip away because the most effective treatments were deemed too expensive? The next hour brought a parade of complications. James's heart stopped twice, each resurrection pulling him further from the brink, but pushing the hospital closer to financial crisis. The experimental treatment alone would cost more than the annual budget of some departments. Every minute added thousands to a bill that would never be paid. In the midst of the crisis, Blackwood himself arrived at the hospital, his private jet having rushed him from a vacation in the Maldives. "This ends now," Michael, he announced, striding into the ICU waiting area in his designer resort wear. "You're destroying everything we built. The board has called an emergency session. Either you stop this madness, or we'll stop it for you." Sarah turned from the window, her face pale but resolute. "My first son died because of your efficiency protocols. Will you take my second as well?" The question wasn't angry, just heavy with the weight of maternal anguish. The monitors screamed again as James's oxygen levels dropped. Dr. Rivera's team moved with increased urgency, each intervention more expensive than the last. Sterling watched the dollar amounts tick up on the treatment authorization screen, knowing each digit was another nail in his corporate coffin. "Your mother believed in you," Sarah whispered, her hand finding Sterling's arm. "She saw something in you that went beyond profit and loss. I saw it too, the night you were born. That's why I kept the photograph all these years, to remind myself that even in a broken system, miracles are possible." The crisis reached its peak as dawn approached. James's life hung by a thread, the experimental treatment his only hope. The board meeting loomed, its outcome nearly certain. Sterling stood at the intersection of two paths: preserve his empire or save a life. The choice he made in the next few moments would define not just his legacy, but his humanity. Dr. Rivera appeared at the door, her surgical cap in hand. "We need a decision now, Mr. Sterling. The treatment protocol requires your direct authorization." Given the costs involved and the uncertain outcome, hospital policy or policy requires CEO approval. Blackwood stepped forward, his voice hard. Think carefully, Michael. This isn't just about one patient. It's about the future of Sterling Industries. Everything you've built, everything your parents sacrificed for. Don't throw it all away on sentiment. The monitors continued their urgent chorus, each beep a countdown to a moment of truth. Through the window, James's pale form lay surrounded by technology that could save him if profit margins allowed. Sarah's quiet strength, her unwavering faith in human dignity over dollars, stood in stark contrast to Blackwood's cold calculations. Sterling looked at his phone, where the board meeting notification flashed like an accusation. Then he looked at Sarah, seeing in her eyes the same compassion that had saved his life 45 years ago. In that moment, all the complex calculations of corporate healthcare distilled down to a single simple choice. The decision he made would echo through the halls of Sterling Memorial Hospital for years to come, a defining moment in the ongoing battle between healthcare as a business and healthcare as a human right. As he opened his mouth to speak, he finally understood what his mother had meant about doing great things, not profitable things, but truly great ones. The Sterling Industries Emergency Board meeting convened in the hospital's main conference room as sunrise painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold and crimson. Board members filled the room both physically and virtually, their faces on the wall-mounted screens reflecting various degrees of anger, concern, and calculation. Michael Sterling stood at the head of the table, his appearance markedly changed from the polished CEO they once knew. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled from hours in the ICU, but his eyes burned with newfound purpose. Robert Blackwood commanded the room's attention, standing to present a devastating financial analysis. Gentlemen, ladies, the numbers are unequivocal. The Thompson case alone has cost us more than $12 million. Our stock has dropped 18% since the Storm Night Miracle major insurance partners are threatening to terminate contracts. This misguided experiment in charity must end. Projected on the screen behind him, graphs and charts painted a picture of impending financial doom. Red arrows pointed downward, profit margins shrank, and shareholder value evaporated. The board members murmured in concern as Blackwood continued his assault. Furthermore, we've discovered something disturbing, Blackwood announced, producing a thick folder. David Thompson, before his unfortunate death, was compiling evidence of what he perceived as unethical practices. His brother James's current treatment could be seen as hush money, a costly attempt to prevent this information from becoming public. Sterling felt the room's attention shift, the implicit accusation hanging heavy in the air. But before he could respond, the conference room door opened. Sarah Thompson entered, supported by Dr. Rivera. Despite her weakened condition, she carried herself with quiet dignity. "If you're discussing my sons," she said softly, "perhaps you should hear the full story." Blackwood moved to object, but Sterling raised his hand. "Let her speak. We've made enough decisions about patients' lives without hearing their voices." Sarah pulled out a worn notebook, David's journal. "My son didn't die because of depression over losing his job," she began. "He died because he discovered that Sterling Industries was deliberately understaffing hospitals, denying treatments based on profit potential rather than medical necessity, and burying the resulting mortality statistics." The room erupted in chaos. Board members shouted objections, legal counsel demanded the journal be surrendered, and Blackwood's face turned an alarming shade of red. Through it all, Sarah's voice continued, steady and clear. "David documented everything. The meetings where you calculated how many nursing positions could be cut before deaths became statistically significant, the algorithms that determined which patients were worth saving based on their insurance coverage, the bonuses paid to administrators who maintained the highest profit margins, regardless of patient outcomes." Jennifer Torres, who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. "These practices, They're still in place at most of our facilities. The Thompson Memorial Fund and recent reforms only affect a fraction of our operations. Sterling moved to stand beside Sarah, physically aligning himself with her cause. I implemented many of these policies myself, he acknowledged. I justified them as necessary evils, as the cost of doing business. But standing in that ICU, watching a mother choose between her own treatment and her son's life, I finally understood what we've become. Blackwood slammed his hand on the table. This is emotional manipulation. We have a responsibility to our shareholders, not to every sad story that walks through our doors. Our responsibility, Sterling countered, is to heal. Everything else, the profits, the stock prices, the quarterly reports, those are means to an end, not the end itself. He pressed a button, and new images filled the screens. Patients whose lives had been saved by the recent reforms, families spared from bankruptcy, communities beginning to trust their local hospitals again. The CFO cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Sterling, while these stories are touching, the financial reality, Sterling interrupted, is that we've been measuring the wrong things. Yes, our stock price is down, but patient survival rates are up. Staff retention has improved. Community trust is rebuilding. These are the metrics that should matter in healthcare. He distributed a new document to the board members, a complete restructuring plan for Sterling Industries. We can maintain profitability while prioritizing patient care. It requires rethinking our entire approach, but it's possible. I'm living proof that change is possible. Blackwood played his final card. The shareholders will never approve this. You'll be removed as CEO before the day is out. Sterling smiled for the first time since entering the room. Perhaps. But as Sarah reminded me recently, some things are worth losing everything for. He turned to address the entire board. I hold controlling interest in Sterling Industries. That won't change regardless of today's vote. So you have a choice: join me in transforming healthcare or step aside for those who will. The silence that followed was deafening. Board members exchanged glances, calculating new equations that went beyond simple profit and loss. In that moment of decision, the future of not just Sterling Industries, but of corporate healthcare itself, hung in the balance. Through the conference room windows, the morning sun illuminated the hospital grounds where patients and families began their daily routines, unaware that their fates were being decided in this stark corporate battlefield. The contrast between the human reality of healthcare and its business machinery had never been more apparent. While the corporate battle raged in the boardroom, James Thompson's condition reached a critical point in the ICU. Dr. Rivera's team worked frantically to stabilize him as the experimental treatment began taking effect, each moment a delicate balance between hope and catastrophe. The monitors surrounding his bed told a story of life clinging to existence by the thinnest of threads. Sarah had returned to her vigil by his bedside, her own pain forgotten in the face of her son's crisis. Sterling stood beside her, watching the medical team's choreographed efforts to save a life that his old policies would have deemed too expensive to preserve. The irony was not lost on him. Every intervention now being employed represented exactly the kind of financially inadvisable care he had once prohibited. His fever's spiking again, Dr. Rivera announced, her voice tight with concern. We need to increase the dosage of the experimental treatment, but the protocol. She glanced at Sterling, knowing that each increase exponentially raised the already astronomical costs. Through the observation window, board members had begun gathering, drawn by the drama unfolding in both boardroom and ICU. Blackwood stood among them, his expression calculating as he watched what he surely saw as the death throes of Sterling Industries' profit-driven model. Do whatever it takes, Sterling commanded, his voice carrying the weight of both authority and conviction. No limitations, no protocols, no cost considerations. Save him. The next hour became a battlefield where medicine waged war against mortality. Each time James's heart faltered, the team brought him back. Each organ failure was met with increasingly aggressive interventions. The cost counter on the treatment authorization screen spun like a slot machine, each digit representing another nail in Sterling's corporate coffin. Sarah's quiet prayers mingled with the beeping of monitors and the urgent communications of medical staff. Her hand found Sterling's, squeezing with surprising strength. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "you've already saved something more important than any single life. You've saved your soul." The crisis peaked as dawn broke over Manhattan. James's body began rejecting the treatment, his systems cascading toward failure. Dr. Rivera called for emergency measures that would require bypassing every financial safeguard in the hospital's computers. The authorization would have to come directly from the CEO, with full acknowledgement of the career-ending implications. Blackwood chose this moment to make his final play. "Think carefully, Michael," he called through the observation window. "This one decision will undo everything you've built. Your entire legacy, gone in an instant. Is it worth it?" Sterling looked at Sarah, seeing in her eyes the same compassion that had saved his own life 45 years ago. He saw David's face in the photograph of his suicide scene, another life sacrificed on the altar of corporate efficiency. He saw his mother's final days in a county hospital, denied the very care he now had the power to provide. Authorization granted, he declared, his voice steady. "Full spectrum of treatment, whatever Dr. Rivera deems necessary. Override all cost protocols." The medical team moved with renewed purpose, freed from the constraints of financial consideration. Minutes stretched into hours as they fought to stabilize James's condition. Each intervention represented a small fortune, each medication a blow against the corporate machine Sterling had spent decades building. Outside the ICU, the hospital stirred to life. Staff arriving for the morning shift found themselves drawn to the unfolding drama. Nurses who had worked under the old protocols watched in amazement as every possible resource was deployed to save a single patient. The story spread through the hospital like a healing wave the night Sterling Industries' soul was reborn. Finally, near noon, Dr. Rivera emerged from the ICU, exhaustion evident in every line of her body, but a small smile playing at her lips. "He's stabilizing," she announced. "The treatment's working. He's going to make it." Sarah's tears of joy were echoed throughout the waiting area, where hospital staff had gathered in silent support. Even some board members were seen discreetly wiping their eyes, the human reality of healthcare breaking through their corporate armor. Sterling felt something profound shift inside him as he watched James's vital signs strengthen. This wasn't just about saving one life, it was about rediscovering the true purpose of healthcare. Each beep of the monitors, now steady and strong, represented not a cost to be minimized, but a life to be cherished. "Your mother would be proud," Sarah said softly, her hand still clasped in his. This is what she meant about doing great things. Through the window, Sterling could see Blackwood on his phone, undoubtedly setting in motion the machinery that would end his career as CEO. But watching James's color improve, seeing the joy on Sarah's face, understanding at last what his parents had sacrificed for, he knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. As the crisis passed and the day shifted toward afternoon, Sterling Memorial Hospital felt different. The staff moved with renewed purpose, the patients sensed the change in atmosphere, and even the sterile corridors seemed to breathe more freely. Something fundamental had shifted in those critical hours, a reminder that at its heart, healthcare was about humans caring for humans. The life or death moment had passed, but its implications would ripple outward for years to come. In choosing life over profit, humanity over protocol, Sterling had not just saved James Thompson, he had begun the process of saving healthcare itself. Did this mother's unwavering love move you? Let's honor her sacrifice with a like. Sometimes the smallest gestures can acknowledge the greatest love. The victory of James's recovery was short-lived. 3 days after his crisis, Sarah Thompson collapsed during her morning visit to his room. The aggressive cancer treatments, combined with weeks of physical and emotional strain, had finally overwhelmed her weakened body. Dr. Rivera's team rushed her to intensive care, but the diagnosis was clear: her organs were failing. The cancer had spread too far, too fast. James, still confined to his bed but conscious, watched helplessly as their roles reversed. Now he was the one staring through the ICU window while medical teams fought to save his mother. Sterling hadn't left the hospital in days, and he stood vigil alongside James, both men united in their powerlessness against the inevitable. "She knew," James said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "She knew how bad it was, but she chose to focus on my treatment instead of her own." The realization of his mother's sacrifice weighed heavily in the air between them, just like she did for David. Always putting us first. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness over the next 24 hours. During her lucid moments, she spoke to the nurses by name, offering gentle corrections to their technique, even as they tended to her. Her lifetime of caring for others persisted until the end. In her final hours, she asked to see Sterling alone. Her voice, barely a whisper now, carried the weight of a lifetime's wisdom. "Promise me," she said, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll finish what we started. Healthcare isn't just a business, Michael. It's a sacred trust." Sterling held her hand, feeling the same gentle touch that had guided him into the world 45 years ago. "I promise," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything will change. Your son's sacrifices won't be in vain." Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I kept that photograph all these years because I believed in the baby you were and the man you could become. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to find our true purpose." Her breathing became more labored. "Take care of James. He'll need someone to remind him that helping others isn't a weakness." As dawn broke over Manhattan, Sarah Thompson, nurse, mother, catalyst for change, slipped quietly away. The monitors fell silent, their absence more deafening than their previous urgency had been. Throughout the hospital, staff who had known her gathered in small groups, sharing stories of her kindness, her wisdom, her unwavering dedication to patient care. James's grief was profound but quiet, shaped by the same dignity his mother had shown throughout her life. When Sterling tried to apologize for not doing more, for not starting the changes sooner, James stopped him. "She died doing what she believed in, fighting for better healthcare for all patients, not just her sons. Honor that by continuing her fight." The news of Sarah Thompson's passing spread through the hospital like a gentle wave, touching everyone differently. Nurses who had worked alongside her left flowers at the nurses' station. Patients who had experienced her care sent cards and letters. Even some board members who had opposed Sterling's reforms were seen wiping away tears when they thought no one was watching. Sterling stood at his office window, watching the sunset paint the city sky in shades of purple and gold. In his hand, he held the photograph from the night of his birth, Sarah's young, hopeful face beaming at the camera, cradling a newborn with infinite possibilities ahead of him. Now, 45 years later, those possibilities had finally crystallized into a clear purpose. Sarah Thompson had saved his life twice, once through her skilled hands, and again through her unwavering belief in the power of compassion over profit. As the light faded from the sky, Sterling made a silent vow to ensure that her legacy would live on through fundamental changes in healthcare delivery, not just at Sterling Memorial, but throughout the entire healthcare system. The loss of Sarah Thompson marked not just an ending, but a beginning, the start of a transformation that would honor her lifetime of service by bringing humanity back to healthcare. The days following Sarah Thompson's passing cast a somber shadow over Sterling Memorial Hospital. Her death became a catalyst, transforming silent dissatisfaction with the healthcare system into vocal demands for change. News outlets that had previously focused on the financial implications of Sterling's reforms now turned their attention to Sarah's story, painting a compelling portrait of a nurse who had dedicated her life to healing others, only to face the same systemic barriers she had fought against. Social media exploded with Justice for Sarah and Healthcare for All hashtags, accompanied by thousands of similar stories from families who had lost loved ones to the cold calculus of profit-driven healthcare. Former patients came forward with accounts of Sarah's extraordinary care over her decades of service, each story adding weight to the growing movement for reform. The hospital staff organized their own tribute, creating a memorial wall near the nurses' station where Sarah had spent countless hours mentoring young healthcare workers. Photos, notes, and memories covered the wall, transforming it into a living testament to her impact. One particular image captured public attention: a young Sarah holding newborn Michael Sterling, the future CEO whose life she would transform twice. Sterling Industries' stock continued to plummet as Blackwood and his allies pushed for emergency shareholder action. But public sentiment had shifted dramatically. Major media outlets began investigating David Thompson's allegations about systemic healthcare corruption, bringing to light practices that had long been hidden behind corporate euphemisms and carefully crafted policies. James Thompson, still recovering in his hospital room, became an unexpected voice for change. Despite his grief, he gave interviews from his bed, articulating the human cost of profit-driven healthcare with the unique perspective of someone who had been both doctor and patient. His story of sacrifice, losing his mobility while saving children, then losing his mother to a system that prioritized profits over people, resonated deeply with the public. Hospital staff began sharing their own experiences of being forced to deny care based on financial considerations. Dr. Rivera revealed how many times she had been required to choose cheaper, less effective treatments to meet profit targets. These testimonies created a damning picture of how healthcare had lost its way in the pursuit of shareholder value. Sterling himself remained largely silent during this period, his grief and determination manifesting an intense focus on implementing systemic changes. He was often seen walking the hospital corridors late at night, stopping to talk with patients and staff, learning firsthand about the challenges they faced. The man who had once viewed healthcare solely through spreadsheets now sought to understand it through human stories. The media dubbed it the Sarah Thompson effect, a fundamental shift in how the public viewed healthcare reform. What had begun as one woman's fight for her sons' lives had evolved into a national conversation about the true purpose of medical care. Healthcare analysts noted a growing trend of hospitals nationwide beginning to re-examine their policies, sparked by the public reaction to Sarah's story. In the hospital chapel, a quiet memorial service brought together an unlikely gathering: nurses who had worked with Sarah, patients she had cared for, administrators who had opposed Sterling's reforms, and even some board members who had begun to question their own roles in the system. The service was simple, reflecting Sarah's humble nature, but its impact was profound. As the aftermath of Sarah's passing continued to ripple through the healthcare community, it became clear that her death had accomplished something her life's work had strived for: forcing society to confront the human cost of treating healthcare as just another business. The question that remained was whether this awakening would lead to lasting change, or if the system would eventually revert to prioritizing profits over people. 1 week after Sarah Thompson's passing, Sterling called an unprecedented joint meeting of the hospital board, staff, and community representatives. The hospital's main auditorium, typically reserved for medical conferences, was filled to capacity. The atmosphere crackled with tension and expectation as Sterling took the stage, looking markedly different from the corporate titan he'd been just months before. "Sarah Thompson saved my life twice," he began, projecting the cherished photograph of his birth night onto the large screen behind him. "First, as the nurse who brought me into this world, and again by reminding me of healthcare's true purpose. Today we honor her legacy by announcing fundamental changes to how Sterling Industries approaches medical care." The changes he outlined were sweeping. The Thompson Memorial Fund would be expanded into a comprehensive program ensuring access to care regardless of ability to pay. Profit margins would be capped, with excess earnings reinvested into patient care and research. Staff-to-patient ratios would be permanently improved, and a new patient advocacy board, chaired by James Thompson, would have real power to influence hospital policies. James, attending from his wheelchair, watched as his mother's lifelong dream of accessible, compassionate healthcare began taking concrete form. The protocols that had contributed to David's death would be dismantled. The barriers that had delayed his mother's treatment would be removed. Her sacrifice would create ripples of change throughout the healthcare system. Sterling's announcement sent shockwaves through the medical industry. Some board members resigned in protest, but others, moved by recent events, pledged to support the reforms. Major donors, inspired by the changes, stepped forward with new funding. Even some insurance companies, sensing the shifting public sentiment, began negotiations to adjust their policies. In a particular poignant moment, Dr. Rivera presented the first draft of the SARA Protocol, a new standard of care that would prioritize patient outcomes over financial considerations. The protocol would serve as a model for other hospitals, offering a practical framework for balancing medical necessity with fiscal responsibility. The initial resolution phase brought both challenges and unexpected allies. Healthcare workers' unions offered support, seeing in Sterling's reforms a chance to improve both patient care and working conditions. Medical schools expressed interest in incorporating the SARA Protocol into their curricula, recognizing the need to train future doctors in both medical excellence and ethical healthcare delivery. Sterling ended the meeting by unveiling a bronze plaque that would hang in the hospital lobby. It bore Sarah's image and her final words: "Healthcare isn't just a business, it's a sacred trust." Below these words was the hospital's new mission statement, reformulated to put patient care at its center. As the audience filed out, many stopped to share stories of how Sarah had touched their lives. A janitor recalled her always learning staff names, regardless of their position. A resident remembered her gentle corrections that had made her a better doctor. A former patient spoke of her holding his hand through a difficult night. The initial resolution wasn't perfect. There were still financial challenges to navigate, systems to rebuild, and skeptics to convince. But something fundamental had shifted. The hospital felt different, as if Sarah's spirit of compassionate care had been woven into its very foundation. James remained behind after the meeting, staring at his mother's image on the plaque. Sterling joined him in silence, both men contemplating the legacy of a woman who had changed not just their lives, but the very nature of healthcare at Sterling Memorial. The initial resolution marked not an ending, but a beginning, the first steps toward fulfilling a promise made to a nurse who had never lost sight of medicine's true purpose. 3 months after Sarah's passing, as Sterling Memorial Hospital settled into its new protocols, Winston delivered a weathered envelope to Sterling's office. The butler's hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the desk. "Mrs. Thompson left this with me the night before she made me promise to wait until the changes were firmly in place." Sterling recognized Sarah's careful handwriting immediately. The envelope was thick, containing what appeared to be old photographs and documents alongside a handwritten letter. As he began reading, the world around him seemed to fade away. "Dear Michael, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've begun the journey I always knew you were capable of making. There's something you need to know, a truth I've carried for 45 years, one that connects us far more deeply than you realize." The letter continued, revealing a story that would shake Sterling's understanding of his own history. Sarah had been more than just the nurse who delivered him. She had been his mother's closest friend, united by circumstances that went beyond the hospital walls. Sterling's mother, Elizabeth, had worked as a cleaning lady at the same hospital where Sarah nursed, both women dreaming of a better future for their children. "Your mother and I made a pact," Sarah wrote. "We promised that whoever survived would watch over the other's children. Elizabeth saved every penny she could, building a small fund for your education. When she and your father died, I made sure that money reached you anonymously, labeled as a community scholarship. It wasn't much, but it helped start your journey." Sterling's hands shook as he examined the included photographs. Images he'd never seen before showed his mother and Sarah together, young and hopeful, sharing lunch breaks and dreams. One photo showed them both cradling him as a newborn, their smiles radiant with possibility. "Elizabeth believed in you completely," the letter continued. "Even when the cancer was taking her, she talked about how you would do great things. Not just successful things, but truly great things. She saw in you the potential to change the world for the better." The most stunning revelation came near the end. The night you were born wasn't just complicated by the umbilical cord. There were other complications, ones that should have been fatal for both you and Elizabeth. The hospital wanted to prioritize saving your mother, as their policy dictated. But Elizabeth made me promise to save you instead. "My son will make a difference," she said. "He'll help people in ways I never could." Sterling had to pause reading, overwhelmed by the weight of this hidden history. All these years he'd built his empire thinking he was honoring his parents by achieving financial success. Instead, he'd nearly betrayed the profound sacrifice that had given him life. The letter went on to reveal that David Thompson had discovered these connections while researching hospital policies. "He found the old records, Michael. He realized who you were, what connected us. That's why his suicide note was addressed to you specifically. He believed that if you knew the truth about your own history with healthcare inequality, you would be forced to confront what the system had become." Sarah's final paragraphs were written with a shaking hand, likely during her last days. "I've watched you all these years, seeing glimpses of Elizabeth's son beneath the corporate armor. When James needed help that stormy night, I knew it was time to bring everything full circle. Your mother believed you would choose compassion over profit, humanity over business. She was right." Included with the letter was Elizabeth Sterling's original hospital bill, marked deceased account uncollectible. The same policies Sterling had later championed had contributed to his own mother's death. The irony was devastating, but I'm sharing this now. Sarah concluded, not to burden you with guilt, but to show you that your current path, choosing healing over profit, is your true inheritance. Elizabeth would be proud of the man you're becoming. Continue this work. Healthcare saved you once. Now you can help it save countless others. Sterling sat in silence long after finishing the letter, the weight of history and destiny pressing down on him. The photograph of his mother and Sarah, young and full of hope, seemed to watch him from his desk. In their faces, he saw the same determination he now witnessed daily in the hospital staff fighting to implement his reforms. The truth had finally emerged, revealing a connection between past and present that went far deeper than he could have imagined. His transformation wasn't just about changing healthcare, it was about fulfilling a legacy he'd never known he carried. The revelations in Sarah's letter sparked an intensive investigation into Sterling Memorial's past. James Thompson, now recovered enough to assist, joined Sterling in piecing together decades of hidden connections. They converted a vacant hospital office into a makeshift research center, walls covered with timelines, photographs, and documents that spanned nearly half a century. Sterling assigned Jennifer Torres to lead a thorough review of hospital records from the 1970s and 1980s. The deeper they dug, the more patterns emerged. Elizabeth Sterling hadn't been the only cleaning staff member who died due to inadequate healthcare coverage. A disturbing trend showed how the hospital's policies had evolved from community-focused care to profit-driven decisions, each change widening the gap between those who could afford treatment and those who couldn't. David Thompson's suicide note took on new meaning as they uncovered his research. Hidden in his personal files, meticulously organized, was evidence that Sterling Industries' rise to power had been built partly on acquiring hospitals in low-income areas, implementing strict financial policies, and effectively pushing out vulnerable populations. The same communities Elizabeth Sterling had come from were the ones most affected by her son's business practices. "Look at this," James said one evening, spreading out a series of documents. David found a direct correlation between policy changes and mortality rates in underprivileged communities. Every time profit margins increased, survival rates dropped for non-insured patients. His hands trembled as he handled the papers, his brother's last work, the research that had driven him to despair. The investigation revealed another startling connection. Sarah Thompson had been quietly working within the system for years, maintaining a network of nurses and doctors who found ways to provide care despite financial restrictions. Her position had allowed her to witness the healthcare system's transformation from both sides, as a caregiver and as a parent fighting for her children's lives. Sterling discovered that his own education scholarship had come from a fund Elizabeth had created by working extra shifts cleaning hospital rooms. Sarah had managed the fund after Elizabeth's death, ensuring it reached him anonymously. The money that launched his business career had been earned in the very corridors where healthcare inequalities now played out daily. As they pieced together the timeline, a powerful narrative emerged. Elizabeth Sterling and Sarah Thompson had represented two paths in healthcare, one cut short by poverty, the other dedicated to fighting the system from within. Their children had similarly diverged, Sterling becoming the face of corporate healthcare, while David and James Thompson fought for patient rights from opposite sides of the system. The investigation uncovered photographs, newspaper clippings, and hospital records that painted a picture of systematic changes in healthcare delivery. Sterling found himself facing the uncomfortable truth that his business innovations, celebrated in financial papers and business schools, had directly contributed to thousands of stories similar to his mother's. Jennifer Torres compiled the findings into a comprehensive report that left no doubt about the human cost of profit-driven healthcare. The data shows a clear pattern, she explained during a private briefing. Every policy we implemented to increase shareholder value had a quantifiable impact on patient mortality rates, particularly in underserved communities. The most painful discovery came in the form of a diary Elizabeth Sterling had kept during her final illness. Sarah had preserved it all these years, and its pages revealed a mother's profound hope that her son would someday understand the true value of healthcare. "My Michael will do great things," she had written weeks before her death. "He has a healer's heart, even if he doesn't know it yet." James, reviewing the evidence of his brother's investigation, found peace in understanding David's final actions. He wasn't just fighting hospital policies, he realized. He was trying to awaken your conscience, to make you see what the system had become. He believed in the same potential your mother saw in you. The investigation's scope expanded beyond Sterling Memorial, revealing how similar patterns had played out in hospitals across the country. What had begun as a personal journey of discovery was evolving into a comprehensive examination of American healthcare's transformation from a community service into a profit-driven industry. Sterling spent long nights in the research room, surrounded by evidence of how far he had strayed from his mother's dreams for him. The photograph of Sarah and Elizabeth, young and hopeful in their hospital uniforms, watched over his gradual understanding of his true heritage and responsibility. The investigation wasn't just uncovering past connections, it was laying the groundwork for fundamental changes in healthcare delivery. Each revelation strengthened Sterling's resolve to transform the system, not just within his own hospitals, but throughout the industry. The truth, hidden for so long, was finally emerging into the light, demanding acknowledgement and action. The complete picture emerged during a private gathering in Sterling's office, where he, James, and Jennifer Torres assembled to review all their findings. The wall-mounted screens displayed decades of interconnected evidence, while Sarah's letter lay open on the desk beside Elizabeth Sterling's diary. The final truth they uncovered was both more profound and more personal than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just about healthcare policies, James said, carefully arranging the last pieces of evidence. It was about a generational cycle of sacrifice and redemption. He pointed to a series of documents showing how Sarah Thompson had strategically positioned herself throughout her career to monitor Sterling's rise to power, waiting for the right moment to bridge the gap between past and present. The investigation revealed that Elizabeth Sterling and Sarah Thompson had been part of a larger group of hospital workers who had dreamed of reforming healthcare from within. Elizabeth's death had galvanized Sarah's commitment to their shared vision, leading her to spend decades documenting the system's transformation while protecting those caught in its machinery. David Thompson's research proved to be the missing link. His suicide wasn't simply a response to being fired, it was a calculated sacrifice designed to draw attention to the humanitarian crisis in corporate healthcare. He had discovered not only the connection between Sterling and his mother's past, but also evidence of systematic suppression of patient care data across the entire Sterling Industries network. "Look at these dates," Jennifer pointed out, highlighting a timeline on her tablet. Every major policy change that increased profits corresponded with a carefully hidden increase in mortality rates among uninsured patients. David found the pattern, and Sarah preserved the evidence, knowing someday it would be needed. The most startling revelation came from cross-referencing Sarah's personal records with hospital archives. She had turned down numerous promotions and opportunities throughout her career, deliberately maintaining her position as a floor nurse to stay close to the human impact of corporate policies. Her choices weren't just about watching over Sterling, they were about gathering evidence for an eventual reckoning. Sterling sat heavily in his chair as the full weight of the truth settled over him. "She wasn't just the nurse who delivered me," he said quietly. "She was the guardian of my mother's dream, watching and waiting for 45 years, believing I would eventually remember who I was meant to be." James wheeled himself to the window, looking out over the hospital grounds. "David believed in you too," he added. "His last message to me said sometimes the truth needs a sacrifice to be heard." He knew his death would create the circumstance for Sarah to finally reach you. The investigation had uncovered a web of quiet resistance within Sterling Memorial nurses, doctors, and staff who had followed Sarah's example, finding ways to provide care despite corporate restrictions. These hidden heroes had maintained the hospital's heart while its policies grew increasingly ruthless. Elizabeth Sterling's diary revealed the full depth of the pact between the two women. "If anything happens to me," she had written, "Sarah will guide Michael back to his true purpose. Healthcare isn't just about healing bodies, it's about preserving humanity. My son will understand this someday." The final truth painted a picture of extraordinary patience and faith. Sarah Thompson had orchestrated a decades-long plan, positioning her own children within the healthcare system, documenting its flaws, and waiting for the moment when Michael Sterling would be ready to confront his legacy. "Your mother knew you would face a choice between profit and compassion," Jennifer read from Elizabeth's diary. "She believed you would choose rightly, even if it took a lifetime to reach that moment." As the last pieces fell into place, Sterling understood that his recent transformation wasn't just about changing healthcare policies, it was about fulfilling a destiny set in motion the night he was born. Sarah Thompson hadn't just saved his life twice, she had preserved his soul's purpose until he was ready to embrace it. James gathered the documentation into a comprehensive file. "The question now," he said, "is what we do with all of this." The truth doesn't just implicate Sterling Industries, it challenges the entire foundation of corporate healthcare. Sterling picked up the photograph of his mother and Sarah, their young faces full of hope and determination. The final truth was both a burden and a gift, a challenge to honor not just Sarah's sacrifice, but the dream that had united two women from different worlds in a common cause. The office fell quiet as they contemplated the magnitude of what they had uncovered. The truth was finally complete, but its implications were just beginning to unfold. In understanding his past, Sterling had found his future path, one that would require as much courage and dedication as Sarah and Elizabeth had shown all those years ago. 1 year after Sarah Thompson's passing, Sterling Memorial Hospital had become unrecognizable from its former self. The austere corporate atmosphere had given way to an environment where healing and humanity took precedence over profit margins. The lobby, once dominated by cold marble and intimidating artwork, now featured a wall of photographs celebrating healthcare workers past and present, centered around the iconic image of Sarah Thompson holding newborn Michael Sterling. The transformation went far beyond aesthetics. Sterling Industries had implemented the Sarah Protocol across all its facilities, fundamentally reshaping how healthcare was delivered. Patient outcomes now took precedence over financial metrics, with success measured in lives improved rather than dollars earned. The Thompson Memorial Fund had grown into a comprehensive program ensuring that no patient would be turned away due to inability to pay. James Thompson, fully recovered and active in his role as head of the Patient Advocacy Board, had become a powerful voice for healthcare reform. His unique perspective as both doctor and patient, combined with his family's story, made him a compelling speaker at medical conferences and policy forums. The reforms he helped implement at Sterling Memorial became a model studied by healthcare institutions worldwide. The most dramatic change was in the hospital's culture. Staff members who had once lived in fear of budget cuts now participated in regular forums to discuss patient care improvements. Dr. Rivera's department had become a training ground for a new generation of doctors who learned to balance medical excellence with compassion. Nurses, inspired by Sarah's legacy, developed innovative programs to ensure every patient received personal attention regardless of their financial status. Sterling himself had undergone the most profound transformation. The former corporate raider now spent his mornings doing rounds with medical staff, learning about patient needs firsthand. His office, once a fortress of corporate power, had become a meeting place where healthcare workers could freely share concerns and ideas. The photograph of his mother and Sarah remained prominently displayed on his desk, a constant reminder of healthcare's true purpose. The financial world had initially predicted Sterling Industries' collapse, but reality told a different story. While profit margins were lower, they were stable. More significantly, patient satisfaction scores soared, staff retention improved dramatically, and the hospital's reputation for excellence attracted top medical talent. The Sterling model of balanced healthcare began gaining attention from policymakers and healthcare reformers nationwide. Jennifer Torres, now Chief of Community Relations, had developed a comprehensive program to track the human impact of their reforms. The data told a powerful story: mortality rates dropped, recovery times improved, and the community's trust in the healthcare system steadily rebuilt. The hospital's waiting rooms, once filled with anxiety and despair, now hummed with an atmosphere of hope and healing. Perhaps the most meaningful change was in the emergency department's response to crisis cases. The protocols that had once required financial clearance before treatment were replaced by Sarah's principle: treat first, worry about payment later. Lives that would have been lost under the old system were now routinely saved, each one a testament to the power of putting care before cost. The transformation reached its symbolic completion when Sterling Memorial received national recognition for healthcare excellence, specifically citing its innovative approach to accessible care. As Sterling accepted the award, he shared the stage with James Thompson and Dr. Rivera, acknowledging that true healthcare leadership came not from the boardroom but from those who directly touched patients' lives. In the hospital's newly established Sarah Thompson Memorial Garden, a quiet space where staff and patients could find moments of peace, a plaque bore the words that had guided this transformation: healthcare isn't just a business, it's a sacred trust. Below these words, the date of Sarah's birth and passing framed a simple truth: one person's dedication to compassionate care could change an entire system. The transformation was complete, but its impact continued to grow. Other hospitals began adopting similar reforms, and a national conversation about healthcare priorities gained momentum. Sterling Industries had become living proof that medical excellence and human compassion could coexist with financial sustainability. As evening fell on another busy day at Sterling Memorial, Michael Sterling stood in the garden, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The once ruthless CEO had found his true calling not in maximizing profits, but in fulfilling the dream two remarkable women had shared 45 years ago. The transformation wasn't just about changing a hospital, it was about reclaiming healthcare's soul. 5 years after Sarah Thompson's passing, her legacy had grown far beyond the walls of Sterling Memorial Hospital. The Sarah Thompson Institute for Healthcare Reform, established in the converted mansion, where Sterling had once hosted lavish corporate parties, became a leading center for medical ethics and policy research. The Institute's mission, bridging the gap between care and access, attracted healthcare leaders from around the world seeking to replicate the Sterling model. James Thompson served as the Institute's first director, his wheelchair becoming a familiar sight in hospital corridors nationwide as he advocated for systemic change. His personal story, from brilliant surgeon to patient, from victim of the system to architect of its reformation, gave him unique credibility in both medical and policy circles. The documentary about his family's journey, Sacred Trust, had become required viewing in medical schools. The Thompson Memorial Fund, initially created to help individual patients, evolved into a comprehensive program that transformed healthcare delivery. Its success challenged long-held assumptions about the inevitability of profit-driven medicine. Other hospital systems, facing public pressure and inspired by Sterling's example, began implementing similar programs, creating a ripple effect throughout the industry. Sarah's influence lived on in unexpected ways. The nursing program she had quietly maintained, mentoring generations of healthcare workers, was formalized into the Thompson Fellowship for Compassionate Care. The fellows trained in both medical excellence and human connection, learning to see patients as people first, not just cases to be managed. Dr. Rivera's department became a model for integrating advanced medical care with humanitarian principles. Her team's research proved definitively that compassionate care led to better outcomes, lower readmission rates, and improved staff satisfaction. The Rivera Protocol, building on Sarah's principles, was adopted by hospitals nationwide. Sterling himself underwent perhaps the most remarkable transformation. The man once known for hostile takeovers now led a movement for healthcare reform, using his business expertise to help other hospitals transition to more ethical models. His annual lectures at medical schools always began with Sarah's story, helping future doctors understand that every policy decision carried human consequences. The physical legacy was equally impressive. Sterling Memorial's transformation sparked a nationwide trend in hospital design. The Sarah Thompson Memorial Garden became a prototype for healing spaces in medical facilities. The integration of natural light, comfortable waiting areas, and staff respite spaces acknowledged that environment played a crucial role in both patient recovery and caregiver well-being. Jennifer Torres developed a comprehensive metric system that tracked not just medical outcomes but human impact. The Thompson Index measured factors like patient dignity, family support, and staff compassion alongside traditional medical metrics. Hospitals nationwide began adopting these measurements, fundamentally changing how healthcare quality was evaluated. But the legislative impact proved significant as well. Sarah's story, combined with data from Sterling's reforms, influenced healthcare policy at both state and federal levels. The Thompson Act mandated minimum standards for compassionate care and financial accessibility, while the Sterling Amendment provided incentives for hospitals implementing similar reforms. Perhaps most meaningfully, Sarah's legacy lived on in the countless lives touched by the changes she inspired. Regular gatherings in the Memorial Garden brought together patients, families, and staff to share stories of healing and hope. The wall of photographs in the hospital lobby grew to include hundreds of healthcare workers who embodied her principles of compassionate care. David Thompson's sacrifice was honored through the David Thompson Whistleblower Protection Program, ensuring that healthcare workers could safely report ethical concerns without fear of retaliation. His final message, "Sometimes the truth needs a sacrifice to be heard," became a rallying cry for healthcare reform advocates. Elizabeth Sterling's dream for her son finally found fulfillment in ways she could never have imagined. The cleaning lady's son had indeed done great things, not by amassing wealth, but by transforming the very system that had failed her. Her diary, published with Sarah's letters, became a powerful testament to the enduring impact of maternal love and unwavering faith. As Sterling Memorial celebrated its transformation's 5th anniversary, the hospital grounds filled with people whose lives had been touched by these changes. Former patients, grateful families, dedicated staff, and healthcare reformers gathered to commemorate not just a change in policy, but a revolution in how society viewed healthcare. The legacy continued to grow, each day bringing new stories of lives saved, dignity preserved, and hope restored. Sarah Thompson's belief in the power of compassionate care had sparked a movement that transcended individual institutions, creating a new paradigm for healthcare delivery. In the quiet evening hours, when the hospital's pace slowed, staff members would sometimes pause by Sarah's photograph, drawing inspiration from her example. Her legacy lived on not just in policies and programs, but in every moment when healthcare workers chose compassion over convenience, humanity over profit, healing over hurry. On a stormy night much like the one that had started it all, Michael Sterling stood at his office window watching lightning illuminate the Manhattan skyline. 10 years had passed since that fateful encounter with Sarah Thompson, and Sterling Memorial Hospital had become a beacon of hope in American healthcare. Inside his office, now warm with photographs and patient artwork, he prepared for a special ceremony. The hospital was inaugurating the Sarah Thompson Center for Integrated Care, a revolutionary facility combining cutting-edge medical technology with compassionate, accessible healthcare. James Thompson, now a distinguished healthcare reform advocate, would be giving the keynote address. The ceremony brought together an extraordinary gathering. Dr. Rivera, her hair now streaked with gray, had returned from heading her own hospital transformation program. Jennifer Torres, recently appointed to a federal healthcare commission, arrived with data showing how the Sterling model had influenced facilities nationwide. Even some former board members who had initially opposed the reforms came to acknowledge the success of putting patients before profits. As thunder rolled outside, Sterling picked up the weathered photograph that had started everything, Sarah holding him as a newborn, his mother Elizabeth beaming beside them. The image had become iconic in healthcare circles, reproduced in medical textbooks and policy papers as a symbol of healthcare's human foundation. The new center itself represented everything Sarah had fought for. Its design incorporated natural light and healing spaces, but more importantly, it embodied a philosophy where financial status never determined quality of care. The emergency department, renamed the David Thompson Memorial Unit, operated on his brother's principle that every life deserved saving, regardless of cost. James wheeled himself to the podium, his presence commanding despite his wheelchair. His speech wove together the personal and professional, the story of his family's sacrifice becoming a call to action for continued healthcare reform. 10 years ago he began. A storm brought together two families separated by circumstance, but united by a vision of what healthcare could be. As he spoke, the assembly watched a montage of the hospital's transformation. Images of the old Sterling Memorial, cold and corporate, dissolved into scenes of the present doctors spending time with patients, nurses mentoring new staff, families receiving care regardless of their ability to pay. The Thompson Index scores, measuring both medical outcomes and human dignity, showed improvements that had once seemed impossible. Sterling's own transformation was perhaps the most powerful testament to Sarah's legacy. The former corporate raider now taught medical ethics, sharing his journey from profit-focused CEO to healthcare reformer. His mother's diary and Sarah's letters had been published, becoming required reading in medical schools nationwide. The ceremony reached its emotional peak when a group of patients whose lives had been saved by the reform policies shared their stories. Among them was a cleaning lady whose experience eerily paralleled Elizabeth Sterling's, except this time, the story ended in recovery rather than tragedy. The symmetry was not lost on anyone present. Outside, the storm began to ease, just as it had on that pivotal night a decade ago. Sterling stepped to the podium for the final remarks, carrying Sarah's old nurse's cap, preserved all these years. "Healthcare isn't just about treating illness," he said, echoing Sarah's words. "It's about preserving humanity. Every policy, every decision, every moment of care is a choice between profit and compassion." Sarah Thompson taught us which choice matters more. The cap would be enshrined in a special display, alongside Elizabeth's diary and David's final research. Together, these artifacts told the story of how personal sacrifice and unwavering conviction could transform an entire system. As the ceremony concluded, Sterling and James remained behind, watching the last rays of sunset paint the hospital in shades of gold. "She would be proud," James said quietly. "Both of them would." Sterling nodded, thinking of his mother and Sarah, their shared dream finally realized. The hospital around them hummed with purposeful activity, nurses making rounds, doctors consulting with families, staff ensuring that every patient received the care they deserved. In the distance, another storm was gathering, but Sterling Memorial stood ready. The lessons of that first stormy night had been built into its very foundation. Every new challenge would be met with the same commitment to compassionate care that Sarah Thompson had championed throughout her life. As night fell, the hospital's lights glowed warmly against the darkening sky, a beacon of hope in a healthcare landscape still in transformation. The story that began with two women's dream of better healthcare had become a movement, proving that even the most entrenched systems could be changed by the power of unwavering conviction and compassionate care.